What do you prescribe creatine for?
I would recommend anytime someone says to me, hey, I don't consume meat daily, look, it's probably a good supplement for you.
And glutamine has been glorified by many, even doctors, for repairing the damaged gut lining or so-called leaky gut. But does it really work?
But there is some interesting research in endurance athletes in high temperatures using glutamine before the events, glutamine having a significant reduction in permeability markers.
Do we really need to have electrolyte every day?
If someone's consuming enough water, they're consuming enough potassium in their diet, they've got enough sodium, and do we really want to add it in? Probably not really worth it.
Jake Dolechal is a holistic coach and nutritional therapist with a deep foundation in functional medicine, performance training, and human optimization. He has completed extensive education in blood chemistry analysis, gut health, peptide therapy, strength and hypertrophy, and rehabilitation. In this episode of Chief Life, we're talking with Jake about the top 5 currently trending supplements and peptides and whether they're worth the investment. Jake is taking us through the history, scientific facts, and experiences from his clinical practice and provides practical tips on application, dosage, and choosing the right supplement for you. All right, let's go into the last one that is a little bit controversial still, but it shouldn't be because it's readily accessible through doctors these days, previously only on the black market. It's a BPC 157.
I first heard about BPC 8 years ago. I was listening to a functional doctor. He made this statement: all of the supplements we use for these leaky gut protocols, he said we can replace all of them and just use BPC. If we look at things like ulcer healing, we look at injuries caused by different medications like NSAIDs, things like aspirin, ibuprofen. The ability of BPC to repair some of that damage is incredible.
So what do you say about colostrum?
Yeah, so colostrum, this is a supplement that does excite me, and it is one that I do use considerably more than the other two we've talked about so far. And for people who aren't aware what colostrum is.
Welcome to Chief Life, the podcast that cuts the crap with science-backed insights on health, nutrition, and performance. Get expert advice, actionable tips, and everything you need to take control of your health and live your best life. Let's get started.
Jake Dolechal, a coach and a chief ambassador. So glad to have you here for the second time. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back.
I have you back because I keep watching your Instagram and you have such a good research and information on supplements that I couldn't think of any better person to invite today and to chat about the top 5 currently trending supplements, which I think are creatine, glutamine, colostrum, electrolytes, and then BPC 157. In many cases, these are either new and don't have enough research behind them, or they don't have research available in that specific area. For example, creatine is very well researched in sports, but is not so much research in cognitive health. So it doesn't mean that when there's not enough research, the supplement doesn't work. Just simply, sometimes it just means there's not enough research yet. And that's why I want to talk to you about, because I know that you will know all the research and you also have a clinical experience with your patients or clients. So I also want to know the real life results and examples. So let's dig into it. I would like to start with creatine, which is like the biggest trend of late. And as I said, there's a lot of research on sports performance, but not so much research on cognitive performance. And I believe that that's the cognitive performance is why most people taking it these days. What do you prescribe creatine for?
Yeah, so creatine is one of those ones that, obviously there's actually heaps of studies on creatine. And like you said, a lot of it is performance and people, think about it from a muscle growth perspective. And I actually want to quickly start there and then I'll jump back to your question, because obviously it's a supplement that people have been talking about forever. I remember when I was a kid, like literally as a teenager, I went to the supplement shop and I was like, hey, what's a supplement I should take? And the first thing they pointed me towards was creatine. And so people traditionally have taken it for performance and for muscle growth. Yeah, people think it's going to help with muscle growth. And it does increase intracellular water. So it will increase like essentially muscle size, but it is not going to enhance the hypertrophy stimulus you get from training. And so once saturation occurs at a sort of cell level, we're not really getting any more growth. We're not actually getting growth anyway. We're essentially just getting this sort of effect on fluid. Now, what it does do is it creates a bit of a buffering effect. So it will help with metabolites. So you will see a bit of a performance enhancement from creatine, but that does not mean you're going to get an extra growth stimulus if you're looking at building muscle. So I just wanted to touch on that hey, I'm certainly not against it from a performance standpoint, but it's not really the anabolic hypertrophy stimulating supplement that people seem to think it is. I think what you've touched on there is much more interesting, where people are now talking about it as, hey, what could it do kind of neurologically? What are some of these other potential benefits that it could have? And, that's where maybe some of that research is a little bit more lacking, like you said. Now, if we take a step back and we look at creatine, because obviously we get creatine from diet, okay? In case people don't know, it's obviously not just a supplement. Creatine is produced, we produce it in our body. It's made up of amino acids like arginine, glycine, methionine, but we also get it in food, in animal-based food. So we get it in, meat, for example. And so if we look at the data we've got on like a dietary creatine intake, so where they do large scale nutritional assessments, usually this would be like American studies. What they see is a correlation actually with dietary creatine intake and lower risk of depression.
Yep.
So even just looking at that is interesting. It's like, okay, this obviously that's not causation, but it's like, okay, maybe there's something happening here from a mood depression standpoint. Now, if you tug on that thread a little bit further and you go a little bit deeper into that research, what we see is, in fact, as a supplement, when we have people who take like antidepressants, SSRI medication, and this study in particular was done in women, so women taking SSRIs, when they add creatine to that, they actually show significantly better results with the creatine added. So, and that's actually within only a couple of weeks they notice those benefits.
But that was my question. Like, a lot of the research on creatine is actually done on people that have some kind of issues, like whether it's vegetarians and they had good results because obviously they don't get the creatine from a diet, or there are people that are on antidepressant medication and they have depression. There are people that are sleep deprived, they're elderly, and it seems to be working for all of those. But is there actually any benefit to anyone, to someone like me? Like, I don't have mental health issues, I don't have sleep deprivation. Like, is there any point of me taking creatine when I already eat a lot of meat?
That's a really good question. So people who are listening to this, you may be seeing online creatine, like you said, has been talked about so much lately. And one trend that I'm seeing, maybe it's just my algorithm or maybe other people seeing it too, is this idea of every single person needs to be taking creatine. I think you've seen that, hey? And I see that and I cringe a little bit, because like you've just said there, if you're A, healthy, B, consuming a high meat diet, why would you need it? I'm
and
not
also,
compelled
how did
that
the
you need it.
humankind survive without the creatine supplement for thousands of years?
Yeah. I mean, like, if we can, because you can do the math quite easily, right? You can look at, okay, how much creatine is in different sources of meat, and then how much creatine do we use daily, and then how much meat would we need to eat daily to maintain saturated levels. And it's not, like, I would say it's not that much. I say this to people and they're like, oh my God, I couldn't possibly eat that much. But for me, it's like, well, that's a fairly normal amount for me.
How much is it?
So, we'd be looking at close to 1 kilo of meat a day. Okay, smaller person will be a little bit less. Yeah, so maybe, and again, it depends on the type of meat we're looking at, but somewhere in the realms of, say, sort of 700 grams to a kilo.
And surely it depends on weight, because a lot of the studies actually were done on per kilo, like creatine per kilogram of weight, because surely I'm 50 kilos, I don't need as much creatine as someone who's
Correct. You'd be much on that lower end, absolutely, yes. So that's such a good point, and I agree completely. So personally, I don't take creatine. Even though, like you said, neurologically, some interesting stuff, mood, interesting stuff, sleep deprivation. I think the sleep deprivation stuff is actually really interesting.
There's a solid science behind it.
Yeah, and especially like they've done studies there in athletes as well, and like looking at their skill performance with or without creatine, and the creatine improving like skill performance in a sleep deprived state. So, there is some cool stuff in that regard. But like you said, mostly we're seeing really cool things in people who have low dietary creatine. Vegetarians would be a perfect example of that. And, people who maybe have, like there was a new study just done a few months ago, and they used relatively high doses of creatine in the context of Alzheimer's. And it did show an improvement in like obviously brain creatine levels, but in symptoms as well.
Really? What was the dose?
So the dose was actually 20 grams a day. So, and now it was not a long, I don't remember exactly how long the study was, but it wasn't super long. And so, the question might be, well, would lower doses for a longer period of time have similar effects? Hard to know. But that's cool because that's the first time we've seen a study like that. Yeah. So again, I think there's heaps of benefits to it. But for a supplement that kind of gets talked about as, hey, every single person must have this, in reality, like if I work with 100 people, I'm probably recommending creatine to 10 of them.
Okay, so who would you recommend it to?
So I would recommend anytime someone says to me, hey, I don't consume meat daily, look, it's probably a good supplement for you, okay? If I have anyone who does have significant neurological concerns, and or mood concerns or depressive symptoms, again, if that person's not consuming a large amount of meat, I'm going to recommend it to them. And then in addition to that, maybe from not from a hypertrophy standpoint, but if I did have someone who was like an athlete who relied on performance, not just muscle growth, but actual performance, I would keep it in their supplement regime as well.
Creatine is good for power type of performance, right? Like Olympic lifting or sprinting, like powerful short burst.
Yes, but it will also help, probably not from a really long-term endurance standpoint, but in terms of muscular endurance, it will also help with that because it will help buffer a little bit of the metabolite buildup that's occurring within a set. Okay. I think most athletes from a performance standpoint will benefit from having it in their diet or in their supplement regime. But again, purely from a body composition standpoint, I don't think it's going to be that important. And like we said, if you are consuming a high amount of meat, I don't think it's going to be that important either.
Yeah. Okay. And so when you prescribe it, how much do you recommend to take per day?
Good question, because traditionally people did that loading thing. People would be like, oh, take 20 grams a day or whatever, and then you go to the maintenance dose. And obviously you're going to get to saturation levels regardless. You don't need to do the loading. And when people do loading, a lot of the time they get upset gut symptoms. They get loose stools or bloating. So I avoid that completely. I just say, hey, let's just start with a daily dose. Let's just stick with that. We'll get the loading phase. You will naturally load over time anyway. Now, the interesting thing is, and I alluded to it before when I was talking about how much meat you need, you don't even need 5 grams of creatine. That's how a lot of supplements will contain about that 5 gram mark, maybe a little bit less. You could easily get away with having that one serving every second day. Yeah. So typically speaking, I'm saying to people, hey, have a teaspoon, 4 or 5 grams, and you might do that on your training days. Yeah. Or we might do it every single day for 12 weeks, whatever, get those levels up. And then if you forget a couple of days here or there, or you have it on days where, actually a protocol I quite like is if I have someone like yourself maybe, who eats a lot of meat, but maybe there's periods of time where maybe you're just not kind of eating as much meat as you normally would, or maybe you're traveling or whatever it might be, that's where then I might add it in.
Okay. That sounds good. And so I actually have never taken creatine in my life, and I'm just wondering, I know that one of the most common side effects that usually women get is the water retention. How common is it, and does it go away, or does it stay the whole time you're taking it?
So that's kind of one of the functions of creatine, is it is enhancing that intracellular water level, yeah? So it would be the same as saying, the analogy I would give someone is, it's exactly the same as when we talk about carbohydrates, yeah? Because obviously if a muscle has more glycogen, it's going to be fuller, but there's going to be more, essentially, water in that muscle. Now, if you say you had someone who was eating carbohydrates and then they stopped eating all carbohydrates, they're going to lose a significant amount of weight in that first week, and that's just going to be water, yeah? Glycogen and water. So it's basically the same deal with creatine. It's like, well, okay, you've got these glycogen and the glucose and water stores, and then you've also got the creatine and water stores. So if you want to up your creatine stores, you are going to get water with that. There's sort of no way around that. That water essentially is going to stay there for as long as you're supplementing with creatine. So that's kind of why some people want to do it, yeah, because it makes your muscles look fuller. But if someone's like, well, I want to be as, this is an important point, because I do have female clients who, maybe they might not be like athletes, but they're, recreational athletes. And they'll say to me, hey, should I be taking creatine? And I'll make it very clear, if your goal is to see the scale go down, you need to be aware that if you do take creatine, you are going to see the scale go up. That doesn't mean you're gaining fat, but the scale is going to go up, clothing is going to fit tighter. Yeah. And so depending on what your current goal is, body composition wise, or, aesthetic wise, or whatever it might be, it may simply not be worth it for you at this point.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. So creatine, great, not for everyone. It depends who you are. Some people need it, some people don't. Some people need it sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's bad. It's just not always needed.
Yeah, okay, I agree. All right, so the next few supplements are the next 4, like the remaining ones, are related to the gut. And I know I just said before that not everyone needs creatine and the humankind could survive without it. However, I think that a lot of the gut supplements are actually necessary in this day and age because not many people have healthy gut. And it's because of the environmental pollution, because of stress, eating ultra-processed foods. We just live in a very toxic environment. And I've had lots of different doctors here on the podcast, and they all said that it's very difficult if you live in an urban area and live the typical Western life to have healthy gut just like that. So let's keep this mindset for the next few supplements, because I think that some of them could actually be potentially beneficial for everyone, but let's discuss it. So the first one on my list is glutamine. And glutamine has been glorified by many, even doctors, for repairing the damaged gut lining or so-called leaky gut. But does it really work? Most of the studies I've read were done on subjects with Crohn's disease, irritable bowel disease, IBS, but is it really beneficial for everyone? Should everyone be taking it, and how much of it as well?
Yeah, it's interesting with glutamine because, again, this used to be one of those ones that like bodybuilders and stuff talked a lot about. Again, I remember, 10 plus years ago, I remember, I would fill my water bottle up with glutamine because that's what everyone is doing in the bodybuilding space. I had no idea why I was doing it. But it has shifted over time and it's become a gut health supplement. And it's interesting that it's now sort of, I do see this a lot from, functional doctors and, functional practitioners where it's like, hey, if you've got gut issues, this is a supplement to use. And you do see glutamine appear a lot in blends as well. So, there's a lot of gut health blends on the market. And every time I get a client come to me and they're like, oh, I'm taking this, gut restore blend, whatever it's called, immediately I'm like, okay, that's going to have like 5 grams of glutamine. It's going to have a little bit of zinc carnosine, a bit of marshmallow root. That's probably about it. Yeah. And typically that's what it is, about 5 grams of glutamine. Now, glutamine, just, in case people don't know, it's an amino acid. It's the most abundant amino acid in the body. And, we're certainly not saying glutamine is bad or it's not necessary. Like, we do need glutamine and it does feed like cells in our body, colonocytes, so in our gut. So it is certainly a beneficial compound or amino acid. But the question here is, should we be supplementing with it? And you made the point about creatine that, we survived as a species for a very long time without supplementation. And the way I would look at supplementation and diet and gut especially is I would say, look, if someone has a healthy gut or a healthy sort of, general health is healthy, there's no dysfunctions, no imbalances, then a good quality diet, and we can argue about what a good quality diet is, but what I would say is a good quality diet should be enough to maintain that health in most cases. But if someone is starting from a point where there's imbalance, dysfunction, there's compromised gut function, gut lining damage, inflammation, etc., okay, diet's going to help, but I do honestly think we're probably going to need supplementation a lot of the time to kind of get over that initial hurdle, and then we can get to a point where maybe we can maintain it, hopefully with diet or maybe just a small number of supplements. So I do think talking about gut supplements is a great idea. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in it. Now, to your point, what does glutamine do? Is it going to be beneficial? And if you, I hate saying this, but if you look at the data on glutamine, you look at the data on, IBD conditions, which is largely what it's recommended for, stuff like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, it is really severely lacking in terms of efficacy. And, there was a meta-analysis done last year on, I can't remember if it was all IBD conditions or just Crohn's disease. I think it was on all IBD conditions. And basically they concluded that there was no significant effect of glutamine at all.
Well, I saw a study that had significant decreases in permeability in just 2 weeks, but they take in 30 grams a day.
30 grams. Yeah. So in that meta-analysis, when they do a subgroup analysis, what they find is at doses above 30 grams for 2 weeks or less, that there was a reduction in permeability markers. Now, that echoes some other research we have actually in athletes. Now, this is one of those areas I would say there's not an abundance of research, but there is some interesting research in endurance athletes in high temperatures using glutamine before the events, and glutamine having a significant reduction in permeability markers. Now, it didn't correlate to symptoms, but it did correlate to permeability markers and like a pretty good test of leaky gut, basically. Now, once again, they're using very high doses in these sort of in this study. So, glutamine is a supplement that I do still use. But again, I use it very selectively. And if I'm going to use it, I'm going to use very high doses, and I'm going to use generally a short period of time. I know that the study you're referring to talked about 2 weeks. I normally would do 2 to 4 weeks with clients. And normally what I would do is titrate up. So some people won't always respond the best to glutamine. Yes, you can get some digestive symptoms, loose stools, whatever. But if you've got issues around glutamate, you can get some neurological symptoms, like a bit of irritability, maybe even insomnia. So I would always prefer to kind of push it up a little bit over time, just to assess how that person's feeling with it. So, I would often start with, say, like the best part of a tablespoon. So you're going to get, 10, 13 grams. And I might do that sort of once a day, or maybe I split that over twice a day. If they're okay with that, then I'll go to that tablespoon twice a day. If they're okay with that, I'll go to a third tablespoon. So, and then I'll hold that sort of high dose for about 2 weeks. Now, typically I'm going to prefer to do that with people who, yes, maybe have IBD conditions, or if we're looking at lab work, at bloods, I would do that with people who maybe have issues around globulin, especially low globulin. So globulin is reflective of like all the different immunoglobulins in the body, the main one being IgG. We do have some interesting data on glutamine having an effect around globulin levels, not globulin in the blood, but in terms of like some oral immunoglobulins. And there is, I don't know if you've seen this study in combat athletes where they used glutamine, again, relatively high doses. We're talking sort of like 30 grams plus, and not quite actually. They were using 0.3 gram per kilo.
Yeah,
so
I wanted to say that a lot of the good studies also use per kilo of body weight, which makes sense because I really can't. I don't see how I would have to supplement same as you when you're like a big muscly guy and I'm like twig. You know what I mean? I don't think. Surely it needs to be related to your individual.
Yeah, totally.
Muscle mass, body type. So. I think that by the calculations, it would have been like 30 grams for you, but maybe like 12 to 15 for me.
Exactly. I tend to just sort of calculate it, briefly in my head and for myself, and then realize, well, hang on, I'm talking to someone else here who's half my size.
I just want to, because people just read all these like blanket statements, and it's not always necessary to take that much, I think. And also, I wanted to point out 5 grams of glutamine. That's like 400 grams steak.
Yes, true. You are getting quite a lot in obviously in meat as well. Yeah, absolutely. So this study in combat athletes, they actually were measuring like immune markers, and they did see like this increase in immunoglobulins in the saliva. But one thing they also noted was a significant reduction in upper respiratory tract infections in those who were taking the glutamine. Now, I find that quite interesting because when I work with combat athletes, they they smash themselves harder than almost any other athlete I work with. And when I look at their blood work, one thing I almost always see across the board is significant impact in immune markers. Typically, white blood cells will be very low, neutrophils will be super low, often globulin will be low, and often I would say sex hormones are usually going to be low as well. And I suspect this is mostly an effect just of very high volumes of training. Potentially there could be an impact there around like weight cutting and stuff as well. But it's not a shock to me that these clients would be more susceptible to, immune issues or illness. And so I think that's an interesting potential application of glutamine. And, maybe especially around parts of the season where, if they've got, trying to make weight or whatever, where, there might be higher volumes of training and maybe people are more susceptible to getting sick. Maybe that could be a time where it might be worth using it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I was just thinking, so far we discussed two supplements, which is creatine and glutamine, and they both are in meat, and they both are mainly research on people with gut issues, like severe gut issues, like irritable bowel disease. This makes sense that those people react really well to the carnivore diet, because that's just...
Absolutely, you're replenishing nutrients that you're just not getting. It's the same, we could look at collagen, we could look at some of these amino acids, glycine, that they're not going to be getting huge amounts of. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess like if we look at the carnivore diet, you're repleting or replenishing a lot of these nutrients that you're just not really getting much of. But what are you taking away as well? Yeah. So it's this sort of magic combo, I guess, of hey, here's some extra support you didn't have, and then here's taking away hopefully some of the triggers and the inflammatory sort of triggers that were there as well.
Yeah. So for someone who, let's say, doesn't have any significant issues, but they just like have a little bit of upset gut because of what I said, living the Western lifestyle, the sad diet, and not exercising, not eating enough meat, would the glutamine have any benefit to them, or would you choose something different?
So like I mentioned, I very rarely use it. I use the high doses, and I use that for people who have what I would say is severe intestinal permeability or damage. And I tend to do that for a couple of weeks, and that's it. And I might consider using it with athletes who are run down, just coming into an event. Or I might consider using it before an endurance event, just because there's that preliminary research suggesting there could be some benefit. They're basically the only times I'm using it. I can count on one hand probably over the course of a year with the amount of clients or maybe two hands with the amount of clients I'll use it with. That said, I also don't want to ignore the fact that there are a significant amount of people who do claim that they feel better if they have, say some minor digestive issues and they take glutamine. There are people who do claim they feel better. Now, in my experience of people who are sort of suggesting that or stating that, often these will be people who maybe are more prone to things like loose stools. I tend to see some of those people feel like they're getting an improvement in bowel consistency. If I had a client come to me and be like, hey, this is really helping me, I'm not going to say, hey, stop it. Yeah. But if they come to me and they're not taking it, it's certainly not going to be the first supplement I'm going to jump at.
Okay. That's interesting. All right. So next one, colostrum, similar but different. There is a reasonably consistent signal that bovine colostrum can improve the surrogate markers of intestinal permeability, especially in specific stress contexts like heavy exercise or use of painkillers. But the direct evidence, it's also not that strong. I think it's because fairly new supplement, right? So the reviews on the exercise-induced gut damage conclude that bovine colostrum can reduce gut damage and permeability in running and endurance settings especially, but there is a little high-quality evidence in IBD or IBS or general gut healing. And I think that the positive results were also at very high doses, like 10 to 60 grams per day. So what do you say about colostrum?
Yeah, so colostrum, this is a supplement that does excite me. And it is one that I do use considerably more than the other two we've talked about so far. And it, for people who aren't aware what colostrum is, this is part of the first milk that a mammal produces. So humans will produce colostrum, cows will produce colostrum. So generally we're talking about bovine colostrum. You can get goat colostrum sometimes, but typically we're just going to be talking about bovine. And so one of the benefits of colostrum, if you think about what the purpose is, like it contains a lot of these active immune proteins to help the infant, right? So it's got immunoglobulins, a good quality, and this is where it can get a little bit interesting, is a good quality colostrum should actually contain lactoferrin. So lactoferrin is a glycoprotein which again stimulates immune function. It's got like anti-inflammatory, oxidative properties. It's very good around a lot of pathogens, incredible anti-parasitic, helps regulate iron absorption. Now, where it gets tricky is lactoferrin is super expensive. So a lot of companies now will remove the lactoferrin from the colostrum. And so, one of the questions I'd have is, well, when we're seeing some of these potential benefits in colostrum, is maybe some of it associated with the lactoferrin, and are we not getting that anymore? So, it gets a little bit messy. Other things around lactoferrin, like it's got growth factors in there. So there's, some minor research suggesting there could even be some performance benefits to it. So it's certainly an interesting supplement. Now, what you've mentioned there around permeability. So yes, there's obviously not a whole stack of research on colostrum. And in fact, this is one of those supplements, and you probably noticed this with organ supplements. So a few years ago, maybe 6 years ago, I was using colostrum quite a bit. I was also using organ supplements quite a bit. And it was so hard to find some of these supplements. Like, there might be one company that's selling them. I heard maybe had one company, or you had to go somewhere, funny to get it. And same with lactoferrin, no one was selling lactoferrin. And now it's like, it's everywhere. Go on iHerb, there's like 12 different companies selling these things. There's a different company every week selling organ supplements. Even just normal like pharmacies and chemists are advertising colostrum. And, these things are just everywhere, right? So obviously it's been driven, I guess, by market demand. But as a practitioner who's been using these things for a while, it's just like, man, I wish I had access to this stuff, 5 or 10 years ago. Would have made life a lot easier. Anyway, I'm going down a tangent. So colostrum, yes. So there's some research around like athletic intestinal permeability, also intestinal permeability in non-athletes. And like you said, they do typically use higher doses. So we're usually looking at about, the low end, the very low end there that I've seen in literature would be 5 grams twice a day. Like that's really low end. Typically we're looking more, that's sort of 10 grams twice a day or even more. Now, if you're getting a colostrum supplement as, a powder, that's not too hard to dose. I would normally dose people, a teaspoon twice a day, teaspoon twice a day. We're going to get that sort of 10 to 12 grams a day. Where this gets a little bit trickier is a lot of colostrum supplements nowadays are capsules. And, how much can you get in a capsule? Usually about 500 milligrams. So the issue is people often will see a supplement get talked about, and like, colostrum, oh my God, colostrum's amazing for leaky gut. And, they see someone talk about it on Instagram, so they go to the chemist and they buy some. And then I do a consult with this client. They're like, oh, I've got this at home. How much should I take? And I'm like,
bottle?
I hate to tell you, but you're going to need like 20 capsules of that. Exactly. And it's like, oh my goodness, that bottle cost me $30 and it'll be gone in 1.5 days. So this is where, I guess the feasibility of some of these supplements or the efficacy in terms of the dose that people are using, it's quite questionable. What I would say with colostrum, I don't know if you've seen some of this data, is low doses for immune support is actually super interesting. So, and again, we don't have heaps of studies here. It would be nice if we had more, but, one study I love to talk about when I'm able to and not going to face any consequences of it, is they did do a study in people who are both high risk and lower risk of like the flu. And they found that a low dose, only, I think they used 1 gram in this study, of colostrum was at least triple as effective as the flu vaccine at preventing the flu. Now, obviously this is not, I think there was 60 plus people in this study, not a massive study, but that's quite interesting. And it does sort of echo and consolidate some other studies we see in kids, for example, or kids who took, I think it was 500 milligrams. So that's like 1 capsule worth. And they had significantly fewer upper respiratory tract infections. I think that was over like 6 months long. Like it was a fairly long study. So this is where if I had a client come to me who was like, hey, I get sick all the time. My family gets sick all the time. My kids get sick. What can I do just for some immune, boosting support? I'd say, hey, a couple capsules of colostrum, at the very least, it'll give you a bit of a boost there. But if we're wanting to use it for leaky gut, that's a whole different story. And that's where we'd be looking at those much higher doses.
And so for the immune system, would you take it all year round, or just when it's like a risky area, like a risky times of the year, like changing seasons, or when would you take it?
Yeah, so I don't see any issue with taking that lower dose, all year. I would normally say to a client, hey, if there's particular periods of that year where you're more likely to get sick, flu season, or you're traveling, or you're stressed, or whatever, maybe that's the time to concentrate and have it then. If you have someone who's like, oh my gosh, I just get sick all the time, my household's always sick. Okay, look, let's just keep it in, add a little bit to your smoothie, add a little bit to your yogurt, whatever it is. It's probably going to be a good addition. I'd say the same thing with lactoferrin.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of lactoferrin. It just doesn't get talked about as much. And you've sort of made this point so far that, hey, a lot of these things happen to be in our food. And if we look at lactoferrin, like, hey, guess where we find that? We find that in milk. So and protein as well. Like if you were to get, whey protein. And you can actually get a decent amount. Like again, if we look at studies, it varies in terms of how much we're seeing. But in milk, and typically, if you look at milk, pasteurizing it will reduce the lactoferrin content, unfortunately. But if you look at studies on unpasteurized milk, bovine milk, you can be getting 50 milligrams of lactoferrin easily in a cup of milk. And if we look at like health benefits, we're seeing health benefits at 100 milligrams a day. So you could quite easily obtain that from a good quality milk. I don't know why I started talking about lactoferrin. We're meant to be talking about colostrum. But
lactoferrin is in colostrum, so I guess. And it's also in whey protein. Lots of people take whey protein as well. So I think it makes sense.
Exactly. Whey protein's a funny one because obviously people take it as a performance supplement, protein, muscle building, whatever. But I'm more inclined to think about it for some of those benefits with the lactoferrin. It's like, hey, this could actually be a really interesting one from an immune standpoint, viral infections, even potentially during pregnancy. It could be an interesting one. Good data on lactoferrin in pregnancy. So whey is one of those. I feel like whey is like an underrated supplement in their like alternative health world. Like obviously in the conventional world, the bodybuilding world, everyone loves it. But then I think there's been pushback in their sort of more, functional health space. And I think it probably a little bit unfairly so.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a great supplement. And you know what funny thing makes me laugh when people ask me, I want a whey protein, there's a grass-fed and grass-finished. And I'm like, well, you can't get grass-finished whey, like, because the cow is not finished, it's still alive. And people just like always, no, but it's not grass-finished, it's not good. Oh my God. Yeah, there's a lot of these things.
Yeah, that's funny. Hey, like that little bit of knowledge, and that's, it's a very funny
And you know what
question.
is also funny? We have to mention this. All the gummies, creatine gummies, glutamine gummies, collagen gummies. Like, how much can you really put in a gummy? Like 1/10 of what you need in a day?
Yeah, so this is like a whole can of worms of a topic, to be honest. I'm gonna say something controversial here. I am not strictly against gummies, and to be honest, and this is like even more controversial. I know I've just said I don't take creatine. I have creatine gummies at home.
And so how much creatine is in the gummies?
So I think it's about 1 gram per gummy. Okay, so you would need 3 or 4 gummies. Now, I think I've got a few thoughts on this, obviously, hence why I've got it in my cupboard. So firstly, I agree that same issue as a capsule, okay? Any issue you run in with a capsule because you can't get enough in it, you're going to run into the same issue with the gummy, okay? You're just limited by how much you're getting in. At most, it's going to be about 1 gram. So yes, there's a big limitation there, depending on the supplement we're looking at. Some supplements don't need a high dose of things. The second limitation, obviously, with the gummies is going to be depending on what compound we're looking at. The mixability might not be that good, depending on how they're actually producing that gummy, and you might actually lose a lot of that compound. Obviously, creatine's been talked about a lot lately because studies or assessments in creatine gummies, a lot of them had very little amounts of creatine. But we also need to mention that some of them actually had exactly what they claimed to have as well. So it's not all of them. And, to be fair, we could look at any supplement. If we look at, I was just talking to someone just before this call about saffron. And, there's research showing that over half of the saffron supplements in this one particular study didn't even contain saffron. Yeah,
Wow.
and yet, we're happy to kind of point the finger at gummies,
Yeah.
but it's like, well, hang on, the normal supplements are not any
Yeah.
better, let's be honest.
Okay.
So that's kind of my beef with that conversation. But what I do like about gummies is, one, kids. Okay, if we've got kids, especially, I've got, a number of clients who have kids on the autism spectrum, and it's very hard to get supplements into them. And they can sometimes even make their own gummies with particular supplements. And usually that's a hit with the kids. Yeah. So I do think, hey, there's a lot of value in this. Personally as well, if I were to take creatine, I spent like 10 years of my life downing that stuff. It's not bad, but I'm sick of it. I'm sick of mixing powders. If I've got the option there of something that doesn't have junk in it and tastes okay, I can just throw it in my mouth, I'm going to choose that. So
Point taken. Maybe we're gonna start making cheap creatine gummies now. You convinced me. I was always thinking like, okay, 1 gram per gummy. Now I have to take 20 gummies if I'm sleep deprived. That's a lot of gummies.
Well, this is true. That would be very expensive that way. Yeah.
Okay, next one. And I think this is the biggest hype ever because everyone is having them and their electrolytes. And I think is a big part of it is social media and all different podcasts. I blame Huberman for it and his element because he's telling everyone that we need to have electrolyte in the morning with our coffee. But do we really need to have electrolyte every day if we are not athletes, if there's not hot environment, we're not sweating, like I'm just average Joe sitting in the office, do I need to have electrolyte with my coffee every single day?
I've managed to steer clear from that. I didn't even know that was a message going around that you need to have it with your coffee, and you've just like hurt me a little bit by saying that. The amount of coffee, I hate the word misinformation, but honestly that's kind of what it is, but the amount of dogma about coffee, it's shocking. But I'm going to do my best not to go down that path. Obviously, I'm very passionate about coffee. I love a good coffee. Yes, electrolytes. Firstly, I guess we need to identify what are we even talking about here. Yeah, so largely we're going to be talking about sodium, potassium. Maybe you would talk about chloride, magnesium. It depends kind of on the particular electrolyte supplement we're looking at. I'm not too familiar with what's in Element or LMNT, however you say. I know it's a fairly high sodium one. I think I'm assuming that's one Huberman uses. I don't actually know. But most electrolyte supplements will have some sodium, at least hopefully some potassium, and then usually there'll be like a little bit of magnesium, maybe a little bit of calcium, a few other things.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to look at electrolytes as a whole, I guess what we'd want to do is look at each of those specific ingredients and say, well, how beneficial are those specific things? And when I get someone coming to me and asking about electrolytes, firstly, if they're using one that's high sodium, my question, to be honest, is like, well, why not just add a little bit more salt to your food? Like, if you genuinely want more sodium, it's not a hard thing to come by. I don't know that we need to go buy a supplement just to get salt. And good quality electrolyte supplements are usually literally just using Redmond salt for their actual sodium content. So it's just go buy that and add it to your meat. But if we were to look at sodium, it's like, well, are most people under consuming sodium? No. Do most people have low sodium on a blood test? No. Are there health concerns with too much sodium? Yeah, kinda. Especially if we look at blood work, we know that sodium levels going up, it's negatively associated with mortality, like higher rate of mortality. It's not a good thing. And so, do we really need to be pumping more sodium-based electrolytes? Well, not necessarily all the time. Yeah, if someone is an endurance athlete and sweating, getting muscle cramping, and this, that, and the other, okay, sure. But does the average person need to go out and buy a high sodium electrolyte? Probably not. I'd be more interested in potassium. If we look at potassium, again, the dietary data we've got, and like people just aren't going to believe this, but the data we've got suggests that about 98 to 99% of people are under consuming potassium. It's out of control. And if we look at certain population groups, it's even worse. If you look at like pregnant women or women who are lactating, breastfeeding, like no one is consuming enough potassium.
Wow.
The need for potassium go up about 10% during breastfeeding. You lose about 400 milligrams or just under in breast milk each day, which is like a significant amount. So I certainly think if we look at potassium, there's definitely an argument to be made that people should, I think, be focusing on how do we get more potassium in our diet.
Yeah.
And whether that's food, if someone's not going to add higher potassium foods, okay, great, get an electrolyte supplement. I don't mind. Again, I don't use an electrolyte supplement very often. I will if I'm like traveling and, I know that I'm not going to be eating normally or whatever. But, if we look at the amount of potassium in things like bone broth and sodium as well, if you look at potassium in coconut water, in milk, I mean, goodness me, like you can get a lot of potassium quite easily dietary wise. And, again, performance wise, is it going to have a huge impact? I wouldn't say the data is that compelling. I don't know if you've seen anything that's better than what I've seen, but
probably not, but you know what I've seen, not with athletes, but so that's why I'm like so torn about the electrolytes, because I have clients that don't drink enough water because they don't like the taste of water.
Yes.
And if they put the electrolyte in the water, that makes them drink more, which means they're more hydrated, and that affects their performance, their cognitive performance, as well as physical performance. So I like it for that purpose. I also have clients that replace soda drinks with drinking electrolyte, which I also like it for that purpose, but that's why the other side of it, why I do not like it, besides the high sodium sometimes, but even the ones they have a good composition of potassium, sodium, calcium, and chloride, a lot of them, or most of them, are made from maltodextrin. They use the maltodextrin as a filler, so Element is 50% maltodextrin, pretty much. And a lot of the ones, they don't use it as a filler, use it in the flavoring, because maltodextrin is used as a flavor carrier. So my question is, if someone has got 1, 2, 3 sachets of electrolytes every day, is that enough maltodextrin to actually damage their gut?
Yeah, I mean, look, even beyond the maltodextrin, you'd also have to look at, what else is in that supplement, right? Like if people are having it for the flavor, are they also using artificial sweeteners? Are they also using sugar alcohols? Like what else is there? Are they using colors?
Yeah.
So definitely that's something we haven't even mentioned, but that's definitely something people need to consider if they are looking at an electrolyte supplement. Obviously, a lot of these more natural type ones aren't going to use those things, but there's a whole stack on the market that will be using that. So as far as maltodextrin, look, for me personally, I'd say this is going to come down a little bit to the individual, right? So some people are certainly going to be more susceptible. Obviously, if someone's got like a bacterial overgrowth, they might be a little bit more susceptible to the effects of maltodextrin. There's some data to suggest it can influence microbiomes, so like bacterial levels in the gut. So, is it something that I would want if I've got a client who's got, compromised gut function, they've got, maybe intestinal permeability or some kind of gut issues, do I want them consuming a lot of maltodextrin? Probably not. Yeah. If I've got someone who's, healthy and they don't have any digestive symptoms or any sort of gut related health consequences or anything going on, am I going to be concerned about the amount of maltodextrin in, 1 or 2 servings? For me, I'm not convinced it's going to be the end of the world. I think there's probably, bigger things out there for us to kind of focus on. But also like, is it sort of a positive that I necessarily want in there? Well, no, not necessarily either, yeah? So I guess a lot of these things come down to kind of cost benefit. Like, is it doing more harm or good? And if you've got someone who is, I mean, goodness me, the amount of clients I work with who are just chronically dehydrated, like, I kid you not, I think I did a whole stack of blood interpretations yesterday, and I think I looked at 4 of people who were chronically dehydrated. Like every single dehydration marker was elevated. Okay, you got a client like that who, that's affecting their energy, it's affecting their performance, it's affecting their bowel movements, which is then potentially leaving them more susceptible to a bacterial overgrowth. Okay, someone like that, yep, great. I think it's probably a good idea. Let's use an electrolyte supplement, get some more water into you, get some more potassium into you. That can benefit sleep, it can benefit motility. Great, yeah? Mm-hmm. If someone's consuming enough water, they're consuming enough potassium in their diet, they've got enough sodium and adding some salt to the meat, whatever, do we really want to add it in? Probably not really worth it. Yeah. I think magnesium is a whole different question, but that's generally not what people are taking an electrolyte supplement for.
Yeah, 100%. But that was a great explanation. All right, let's go into the last one that is a little bit controversial still, but it shouldn't be because it's readily accessible through doctors these days. previously only on the black market. It's a BPC 157, aka body protection compound, which is a naturally occurring gastric peptide that promotes mucosal integrity and homeostasis. And people usually take it for healing from training or from injuries, and people nowadays also started taking it for their gut health. What is your stance on it, and do you recommend it?
So I first heard about BPC maybe 8 years ago, and I was listening to a functional doctor who specifically worked with people with IBD conditions and permeability conditions, and he made this statement, and I like literally remember I was sitting in my car listening to this, and I pulled over. I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. He goes, essentially all of the supplements we use for these leaky gut protocols, he said, we can replace all of them and just use BPC. I was like,
really?
What? Yeah, I was like, what is this compound? And, since then, obviously, I dove pretty heavily into it, and I've probably used it with at least, I'd say, 1,000 people, and I use it myself. I don't want to make it sound like this is the single, magic pill or injection that will solve all of life's problems and, everyone will be fixed overnight. Certainly I'm not saying that. But the potential upsides to it, I think, are absolutely huge. So like you said, it is a naturally occurring peptide. Obviously, when you buy it as a supplement, we're getting a synthetic form, but, presumably or apparently was derived from gastric juice. And there is, the criticism people will say is, hey, we don't have a lot of human data on it. Yeah, that's true. We don't have a lot of human data. And, I guess the next question would be, well, why is that? If we've got some of these peptides that have existed for, some of them for multiple decades and have been identified, why don't we have that kind of research? And, sometimes it's a matter of sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, it's a matter of just funding and money. And, who's going to be able to make money out of it. An example I love, and I know this isn't BPC, but another peptide called larazotide acetate, which has gotten the furthest as far as any treatment has gone for research in celiac disease. And it got to...
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God, message me about it. I have celiac. I want to know.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll send you the study. And they got to the third phase trial, and then they decided, you know what, the amount of money it's going to cost us to do a large enough trial is not worth it.
It's so expensive. That's what people don't realize. And also when people tell me, oh, this study was funded by a company that sells the product, I'm like, yeah, because
no one else is going to fund it.
They're not going to pay for it. Like, if I was a researcher and I wanted to research a collagen, the first person I'd be asking for funding is someone who makes collagen, right?
100%.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that the study is skewed. It's just you need to get the money from somewhere. I asked about like how much studies cost, and like the most simple study at Monash University is like $250,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so. Exactly. I think that it's a very basic argument, to suggest that, hey, if there's any sort of funding that's come from any company that's producing this supplement, it's bunk. It's like, well, hang on, who else is going to be funding this? Especially if we're looking at things like peptides or natural supplements. There's not a lot of money to be made with some of these compounds, especially stuff that might be harder to patent. So there's simply not going to be the same kind of funding available. Now, that doesn't mean we might not get more research into some of these things, especially as they become more popular and they're, more utilized and accepted, I guess, medically and conventionally. Then hopefully we might see a little bit more research. But again, we're going to then require grants. It's not going to be private companies who are going to necessarily be funding this. So there's huge limitations, but nonetheless, BPC, yes, not a whole lot of human data. I agree. When people want to make that argument, that is true. We do have some pretty interesting case studies. So obviously there's a whole stack of anecdote, and I can share hundreds of anecdotes. But if we look at documented case studies and published case studies, we do have some. There was, one sort of, collection of case studies in people with knee injuries. And I think it was about 16 people with knee injuries, and I think 14 of those 16 they claimed that they noticed benefit using BPC. I think 2 of them also used TB500 with the BPC, which is often combined. Yeah. So that's obviously, it's not evidence per se or strong evidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. We do also have one study which is impossible to access. I don't know if anyone else has been able to access this, but I've only been able to find where they deliver the study at like a
Abstract?
not even the abstract, like a what would you call it, like a symposium or like an event, and they sort of share the study findings there. I've not found the published study online, but they use BPC as an enema, and they used it with people with ulcerative colitis.
Oh, wow.
And they claim, I forget how many people they had, how many participants, but they actually saw significant improvement in ulcerative colitis symptoms and even in colonic tissue. So there's actually a histological change. So that's quite interesting. Now, obviously, people are not using BPC as an enema very often. I've never heard of anyone doing that, but this is cool human data that we're starting to see come to surface.
Okay.
So if we then look at, well, what's the animal data show us? I mean, the animal data is just amazing, right? If we look at things like, ulcer healing, we look at, injuries caused by different medications like NSAIDs, things like aspirin, ibuprofen, the ability of BPC to repair some of that damage is incredible. One thing that I think is incredibly interesting is the data with glucocorticoids. So if you look at things like, say, cortisone, for example, well, these medications will actually delay healing. And, obviously a lot of athletes are using these medications. And so A, they delay healing, and B, they might actually speed muscle atrophy. So they're essentially the effect around the like cortisol can actually, this hypercortisolemic state might actually increase muscle protein breakdown. Now, in these animal studies where they've tested this, they've actually added BPC alongside, and it's mitigated all those negative effects. So that makes me wonder, okay, not only if someone's using these medications, might BPC be beneficial alongside it? And I think that's actually a really underutilized avenue where we have some of these natural compounds, obviously BPC synthetic, but other things like PEA, for example, where we can look at some of these compounds and how they mitigate the damage caused by some of these pharmaceuticals. And yes, they could be like a replacement or an alternative, but I think at the very least they should be used alongside these pharmaceuticals. We know PEA reduces the permeability caused by NSAIDs. We know BPC can do that. Well, if someone's going to use these medications, why not add some of this stuff in to, at least increase the efficacy, but hopefully mitigate the downsides as well.
Yeah.
So I think for athletes who are using some of these, this is where BPC could be really interesting. Obviously, BPC is banned by WADA, so if you are a tested athlete, there's some you have to be aware of that. But I do think it's underutilized from that standpoint. Now, I want to mention one study on BPC because this just came out this year. I don't know if you've seen this one yet. So obviously people use BPC, any kind of injury, people will use BPC. Yeah? And there's, people will ask, hey, can I use it orally? Do I have to inject it? Do I have to inject it at the site, where the injury is? And maybe we'll just quickly cover that. So my experience is that kind of all of the above will help. Even orally will help. I do get people reporting back to me that they do, on balance, seem to see potentially some extra benefit of injecting it at the site of injury. But I certainly have had a lot of people who seem to have benefited from it, injecting just into the abdomen, regardless of where the injury is, or even taking it orally. So from that standpoint, my suggestion to clients is normally, hey, if you can inject around the injury site, that may be a little bit superior, but as long as we're using it, we're going to get some of those benefits. If we look at it from a gut perspective, typically, again, on balance, I'd say most people I'm working with tend to report good benefits taking it orally. I do occasionally get some clients who maybe didn't notice much of a benefit taking it orally, and then they used it injectable, and they noticed gastrointestinal benefits injectable. So I do think there's going to be like a little bit of nuance, a little bit of individual, variability there. I do think across the board, though, both are going to be beneficial. We do know that there's going to be a loss in like some efficacy with the oral, and so typically you will dose it higher. And one other thing I would say with the oral is, and you can make this argument with any supplement, it's a way we take the supplement, we need to take a supplement in a way that's going to help that supplement be effective, and so we don't just need to look at quality, obviously that's a concern as well, but are we taking that supplement properly? And if we look at something like BPC, a peptide, if we're consuming that orally, hey, we don't want to have it with well, we don't want to have it with any food to begin with, but you certainly don't want to have it with anything acidic, because we are going to break down more of that. So my suggestion with something like BPC or any oral peptide would be, hey, let's have it away from food. Let's have it with like a big glass of water. Let's try to actually dilute some of that stomach acid. Hopefully as much of that will survive as possible. So, I do wonder when people say it didn't do anything for me, how are you having it? Were you having it with a meal? Were you conscious of how you were supplementing? But I did want to say this new study. So there's a study, obviously we're talking a mouse study or rodent study. But the point I wanted to make, that's why I introduced it actually, is people often will use BPC for like, ligament injuries, tendon injuries. And, that's maybe an area where there's like a little bit more question as to like how effective might it be. Yeah. Now, in this study, they actually surgically detached the quadriceps tendon and a part of the muscle as well from the insertion on the patella. Okay, so they fully detached this part of the muscle. And then they had one group of mice or whatever consuming BPC. They had it added in the water, they were drinking it. And then the other group was just control group, they didn't have anything. And the group that were consuming the BPC had complete reattachment of the tendon to the bone.
Wow, that's what I need. My hamstrings are detached from the bone.
Okay.
I just inject it straight into the tendon.
Just add it to your drinking water and just drink it every day. I mean, like,
oh God.
Goodness. And, obviously, like, I'm not going to look at that and be like, well, therefore, it's definitely going to do this in humans. But that's pretty interesting. And,
that is.
So, I've had clients who've used BPC for so many different things, like wisdom teeth removal, like healing after that. And I've had, even surgeons, literally I've had clients go back to their surgeon after, having some kind of operation or whatever. And the surgeons question them and be like, what did you do? I've never seen healing this quick. And, I've had clients say, hey, I took this compound, it's called BPC. And generally speaking, the kind of response they get is, I don't want to know about it, that's illegal, blah, blah, blah.
It's not illegal anymore.
Exactly. You can get it, you can get it prescribed. Exactly. But, typically a lot of people are seeing this sort of, maybe like 30 to 50% quicker healing, sometimes maybe even more than that. So, gut perspective, any kind of like, IBD condition, any injury, those are particularly where I'm using it.
But my question is, to interrupt, what is the mechanism by which it improves the healing? Is it because it reduces inflammation? Because if it speeds up growth, then it could be potentially dangerous in getting growth of cancer or something like that.
Yeah, really good question. That's like the main question that I see whenever I talk about BPC. Someone will be like, it's going to cause cancer. So yes, what we're seeing, it increases angiogenesis. Yeah, so it's increasing blood vessel. Now that is good from a healing perspective. And the really interesting thing with BPC is it's relatively selective in how it does this. Okay, so it's not increasing VGF and angiogenesis everywhere. It's actually kind of working off like signals in the body and increasing in particular areas. So that's why it's going to be more effective where someone's injured. And that's also why you probably don't need to inject at that injury site, because it's kind of like, it's called a smart peptide, and it kind of works out where that injury is. Yeah. Now, which, makes me wonder, and I've got nothing to support this hypothesis, but, if someone's injured, often they kind of don't do, like they'll rest that limb or whatever, they won't do anything to aggravate it. And I wonder, maybe if we moved it, I'm not saying like injure it more, but maybe if we actually promoted like a little bit of movement, promoted like a little bit of blood flow, maybe that'll upregulate some of this signaling, which maybe would enhance the effect of BPC. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure if you could even find where to look for that kind of information.
Normally when you're injured, you actually have to move, like unless you have a broken leg, but like, let's say if you have tendon injury, you have to move to increase the blood flow into the tendon, otherwise it's just not healing.
Exactly. So I suspect using BPC in that way would probably have the same effect. But so angiogenesis. So the concern would be, say someone had like a tumor, is that increase in blood supply, is that going to exacerbate tumor growth? Now, this is where I would say, firstly, we're not telling everyone to run out and buy BPC. Yeah, we're not saying you need to do this. But if we do look at the available data that we have, we see that BPC has anti-tumor properties. And there's multiple studies that show that. Now, again, does that mean that we couldn't possibly get some new data at some point? No, it doesn't mean that. But at this point, we've got two options, right? So we've got this mechanism of sort of like a selective increase in VEGF, and could that theoretically increase blood supply to tumors? Theoretically, it could. We're not seeing that. The evidence we're seeing is showing anti-cancer benefits, right?
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. So, if someone wants to be extra cautious, by all means, but I think it's a long stretch to say, oh, well, it will do this. No, the available data we've got suggests otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great to know. So next question, we can get it now from doctors. If you do like the whole consultation, you can get it compounded in Australia, and that's obviously safe. However, a lot of my friends and clients buy it on various different websites. What are the risks of buying it off such a website? Like, what could potentially happen? I'm not saying it happens, but what could potentially happen?
Yeah, totally. So, it's hard to find that kind of data as to what percentage of peptides might be bunk or whatever. But if we do look at some of the data we do have on sort of these more like underground type, supplements or products, we do see that a significant amount, usually about 50%, they don't contain what they claim to contain. And that might be any mix of don't contain any of that thing. It might be that they contain other things as well. Or it might just be that they contain different amounts, right? So there's obviously that danger of maybe I'm not getting what I thought I was getting. And that's probably a fairly low risk. That's not the end of the world if you got a little bit less BPC than you were expecting. Or a little bit more.
But what about if it's something different? I think I'm getting BPC and I'm getting Ozempic or something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ozempic's probably, BPC, I'm pretty sure by weight it costs more than gold. So, I was going to say Ozempic's expensive as well, but probably not as expensive as BPC. It could be, I don't know what a cheap comparable peptide would be, but, I wouldn't be at all shocked if places were doing that. The biggest concern I've got is that we do know with some of these vials that people are using, injectable substances, that it's not uncommon for some of those to be contaminated with things like endotoxins, so something called lipopolysaccharides. And, this is not just a problem for peptides. This is a problem for basically anything that's coming in a vial. But, endotoxins or LPS, in studies where they want to induce inflammation, they're using LPS, they're injecting mice with LPS. So do we particularly want to be injecting ourselves with that? No, we don't. So you've got the concern over, does it have what it should have? And then does it have maybe something toxic that could be actually making things even worse? So it is a tricky one. I would never suggest a client just jump on Google and look up peptides and buy off whatever website comes up. And certainly don't just do that and buy off the cheapest website, because you are most likely not getting what you're paying for, or well, you're not getting kind of what you want at the very least. So it is tricky. And obviously you can ask the company, hey, do you do batch testing or third-party testing? Can you provide me some reports? And hey, we live in an era of AI and you can fudge anything very easily. So
100%.
It's very difficult, me personally, and with my clients, I tend to only recommend places that I know personally, where I trust that there's no issues there, which is difficult if you're just an everyday person and you don't know any of these. And hey, you can look at what other people are recommending, and you can look at whatever forums or whatever, but it's and like you said, you can go to your doctor, you can get it prescribed if you've got an open-minded doctor. But quality is definitely a big concern.
I just wanted to point this out. Well, that was great. I have one last question. It's a little case study. If you had someone who is otherwise healthy, all their blood tests, vitamins, minerals, hormones, everything is healthy, but they have crazy gut inflammation, they get calprotectin test and it's 1,500. What would you recommend them to do? Would you recommend them to take any of these supplements, or what would be the guideline?
So in this stool test example, they've got very high calprotectin. Essentially, that's confirming for us is very high amounts of gut inflammation. Okay, so what I would be looking in that situation is the first thing I want to do is reduce some of that inflammation, and that's going to have a knock-on effect then to symptoms. Normally, I'd expect in that situation, someone's probably experiencing things like a lot of loose stools or bowel movement urgency. Maybe they're even getting like blood in their bowel movements, that kind of thing in their stools. So my first step I would normally look at doing is, hey, how can we just reduce as much gut inflammation as possible? And the two kinds of things I would do in that scenario would be, one, hey, what are the triggers we can take away? And some of the classic ones would be alcohol. Often gluten will be a big one for a lot of people. Processed foods as a whole are going to be a big one. Anything that is having a big effect on cortisol. I don't want to make cortisol sound like the enemy by any means, but if someone's like simply not sleeping, that's going to have a negative effect. Again, some of these medications we've talked about, NSAIDs, can be a factor there. So I would just try to identify, is there anything obvious in that person which could be this trigger? Let's take that out, yeah? Then on the other side of that fence, we want to do things that are going to reduce the inflammation. And firstly, I'll be looking at, and we didn't talk about it today, but one that I really love is curcumin, and there's quite good data on curcumin for actually helping restore like each layer of the gut lining. And there's even good data in both like ulcerative colitis, IBD, which typically you'll see very high levels of calprotectin in. So I would look at, hey, let's add in maybe some things like curcumin. I also very much like quercetin. That's sort of another polyphenol, and I would normally look at some probiotics in that instance as well. There's really good data on probiotics, especially something called Mutaflor, which is a type of E. coli, which is difficult to get in some places. In Australia, it's really easy. You can go to the chemist, often they'll have it. But overseas, it can be a little bit more tricky. But there's very good data on on Mutaflor actually helping reduce high calprotectin. Yeah. So that's kind of the first step I would go is hey, let's just reduce that inflammation. I'm probably not going to use glutamine there. That's a bit of a wild card for me. Creatine's not going to have a big sort of impact there either. Electrolytes aren't going to do a whole lot. Maybe if they've got 20 bowel movements a day, okay, maybe we've depleted some of that, so we might add some in, but it's certainly not going to fix it. And then after we're just going to kind of like calm the flames and put the fires out a little bit, that's where I then want to focus on repair. And so that's where I do think BPC would be very interesting. Again, if the person sort of knew exactly, like let's say they had a diagnosis, so they knew it was an IBD condition, or they knew it as celiac disease, or whatever it might be, okay, then that might shape a little bit of what we do, more because it's going to tell us what the type of damage we're looking at is, right? So I don't want to kind of go too far down this rabbit hole, but if we were to look at gut damage, often we're going to see a lot of these conditions go back to damage of what are called goblet cells, and that's cells that produce like this mucus. And so what are things we can do to help support that mucus? And things like zinc L-carnosine can be quite good there. Again, curcumin can be beneficial. Boswellia actually helps promote some of those cells. So that could be one issue. Or some of these like other gut conditions go back to damage of what are called panocells. Like Crohn's disease, you tend to see more damage there, whereas like ulcerative colitis, you tend to see more of this damage to this mucus. If we look at issues that are damaging more panocells, that's where we might look at some potential other compounds could be interesting there. Curcumin again is actually going to be beneficial in that instance. Again, I'm a huge fan of curcumin because it does so much. But there's even things like beta carotene is a really interesting compound there. Again, I love BPC. I'm probably going to keep that one in regardless. And then there's other peptides we haven't even touched on, like GHK-Cu is a really interesting healing peptide. It also does affect angiogenesis, but it promotes collagen synthesis. Okay. Now, obviously, gut lining collagen, so anything that's going to help with that is going to be beneficial too. So, typically, in a nutshell, I'd say, hey, let's see what triggers we can remove. Yeah. Let's just calm down that inflammation as much as possible. And then how do we look at actually repairing what some of the damage would be? And that's the bit where I'd be looking at pulling in, some of these peptides. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that was great. Thank you so much. I know you were the right person to get onto these questions and supplements. You made it a whole lot clear. And thanks so much. And I hope I speak to you soon about more stuff.
Likewise. Thank you for having me again. And hopefully that's given people a little bit to think about in terms of what supplements they do or don't sort of add into their arsenal.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye. Thank you for listening. Let us know in the comments below what topics interest you, and don't forget to follow us.